today is all COVID news, which I suppose is not a surprise. If you followed any of the news in Japan, you will know that there's been a spike. Osaka and Tokyo have both gone back into states of emergency. The prefecture I work in, Aichi, is going to go in a state of emergency from tomorrow. So it's just getting worse all around. And that means every news story is about Corona and or the Olympics. So therefore, every story today on Ninja News Japan is also going to be about the Olympics and or Corona. So I was trying to figure out, this is the problem I have consistently, is if there's a lot of stories about the same topic or the same theme, do I put those all together at the front and then a couple of random stories at the end? Or do I put the random stories at the front? I want to do that. So if you get tired of hearing about Corona, you can just cut it off. I shouldn't be making ways for people to cut off the podcast. But I do, because I care about your time. And if you don't want to hear about Corona, I still get very down about Corona. Especially now that I know that other countries, other rich countries, they're basically getting it under control. They're getting people vaccinated. The vaccination rate in Japan, I think they just hit 2%. And that means old people and medical professionals. And now it's going to be people with underlying conditions are the next group that are targeted. The health ministry wants all prefectures to set up mass vaccination centers. That's a pretty good idea because you should have done that already. They have just this morning, in the news that I read, approved a third. It's not a vaccine, though. It's a medicine to help take care of. It's actually a rheumatism medicine, and it's anti-inflammatory, and it really helps people survive Corona. So that's actually not related. So I shouldn't have started that bit. They want to be using Moderna as they're still trying to get approval for a second and third vaccine. And that's hopefully going to come in the next few weeks. What they're aiming for is 1 million shots a day, which sounds like a lot until you realize how many people need shots. So I think the population in Japan is 135 million, something like that. So that would be 135 days if you actually achieve this goal of 1 million shots a day. But a lot of these things you have to get 2 shots. So it's not going to be 132, or let's say 135. It's going to be 270. So now when you start doing the math, the best case scenario is 7 months for everyone who's over 16. That would be amazing work if they're following this sort of numbers that they're giving out. 7 months to get everyone in Japan over 16 vaccinated. They have failed to take into account the need for healthcare workers. They don't have enough healthcare workers to actually achieve this. They've now started, if you remember the story from a few weeks ago, where they started saying, oh, dentists can do it. And they got the SDF coming in. I'm pretty sure soldiers are going to be doing it. That's fine. I don't think people jabbing you in the arm is really a high skill thing. I get that you want to be careful about it. You want it to be safe, but realistically, it is just a needle, sticking a needle in someone's arm. If there's after effects, I want a doctor around for that stuff. But yeah, if you want to stick a needle in my arm, I used to give my grandfather insulin, and I'm not a medical professional, but I mean, it worked out. The idea would be from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day from May 24th in Tokyo. So this is only in Tokyo because it's going to be the first mass vaccination center, but it would be the model for the rest of the country. They would just be giving out vaccinations. But that means you need people there to work, and they don't have the people. That's going to come into other stories later on. So look out for that. Oh, wait, here's the other story where it relates perfectly. The Olympics. Last week, Suga said they wanted 500 nurses, and everyone got really upset because it's not like he seemed to take into account. He said, I heard that X amount of nurses were taking time off, so it shouldn't be hard to get, X amount of volunteers, nurse volunteers. But they're taking time off because they're exhausted, because they're trying to take care of COVID all the time. This is only for the Olympics. They want 10,000 healthcare workers. So I'm assuming that's doctors, nurses, just, general triage. I guess it's not triage. when I went to judo tournaments, they always had like, medical guys there in case you broke your arm or something. So I don't know what those guys are called. They're not nurses. They're not actual doctors. They're just like health care. Yeah, triage. They do triage. They want to do daily PCR tests on the athletes. This is related to last week's story. They've asked the Japanese Nursing Association for 500 volunteers. And when they said that, everyone went apeshit. Everyone on the internet went apeshit. And it's because it's like, okay, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. The problem is these people are already overworked. The nurses specifically are already overworked. The story from last week was they're all taking time off. They're taking time off because they're exhausted. And some of them are actually quitting the medical profession. They're quitting being a nurse. Asking them to volunteer their time seemed a little much. So people are like, you don't appreciate nurses. You don't really appreciate what they do. The Medical Workers Union asked for the request for 500 volunteers to be revoked. So they're actually saying, like, the union is saying to the government, or I guess that's the government. I keep saying the government. It's the official Olympic Committee in Japan. They're saying, please unrequest 500 volunteers. The original plan was most healthcare workers would volunteer. And this is given the image that, like, the Japanese government cares more about the Olympics than it does about the actual well-being of the people who are supposed to be taking care of everyone else, like healthcare workers, so nurses specifically. And it's honestly, that is probably true. This is a story from a while ago. There's this Olympic swimmer, and she got cancer, and this politician, he got in trouble because he went on and he said, I hope you get healthy really soon so that you can go to the Olympics and win us medals. And everyone lost their minds. They're like, this person has cancer and you're talking about medals? Like, didn't no actual, like, I hope you get healthy. I hope your family is okay, stuff like that. It was just like, you might win medals for Japan, so get healthy so you can win medals for Japan. He apologized, but we've done apologies a million times on Indonesia Japan. They mean nothing. I mean, that's actually the problem, is these apologies mean nothing. Because, yeah, he doesn't care about the person, just like these guys don't care about healthcare workers. All they care about is that the Olympics go through and they go well, and Japan looks good in the long run. Of course, the situation with COVID is getting worse. Let's talk about that. The world's oldest person, 118 years old, is a Japanese lady, and she was supposed to join the torch relay. So the Olympic torch is going through, I guess, her town, and she dropped out because she was worried about coronavirus, which is pretty reasonable. I figure the reason she's 118 years old is because she's smart enough to go, I'm not going to go out into a public place when there's a pandemic going on and grab a torch that's been touched by other people and walk through crowds of people. Yeah, that's how you get to 118, is by not being a moron. Don't take virus risks and you have a much better chance to live to 118. That's the moral of that story. But I did appreciate the idea that she's like, nah, I'm not. I know I said I would do the Olympic torch relay. I'm not going to do it. This takes us to an online petition now to cancel the Olympics. It's only interesting. This is not a surprise. There's a segment of the population that doesn't believe the Olympics should happen. I actually am part of that group. I didn't go and protest or anything, but I actually don't think the Olympics right now is a good idea, especially in Japan. If you moved it to another country, which I know is completely unreasonable, it would be more likely to go successfully. That's maybe the first thing. Yeah, I think Japan, now that the situation is actually getting worse, we're 10 weeks out? I actually wrote that down somewhere. Yeah, 10 more weeks to the Olympics. And the virus we're going into a state of emergency from more prefectures. It's getting worse. It just doesn't make sense to have the Olympics now. But a lot of people feel that way. Change.org, there's a Japanese version. It's still change.org. I guess it's not. Yeah, it's the Japanese language version of change.org. There's a petition to cancel the Olympics, which is pretty sensible. It was started by a lawyer called Utsunomiya Kenji. It had 206,000 signatures last Friday. It was the fastest petition to 200,000 signatures since the Japanese version of the site was launched in 2012. Whew, got through that one. Which is showing that there's a lot of people thinking about this. I think Japan is a country, they don't do a lot of protesting. They don't do a lot of, they don't push back, certainly not in a vocal way. This actually shows that the population, because each one of those signatures actually represents a bigger segment of the population. There was a thing I read, and it was about surveys and stuff. And basically every complaint you would get on a survey, every negative survey actually represents X amount of more people. So it'd be like, say, 10 more people. So there's 10 people. Only one of them is actually going to go forward and complain, but there's 10, 11, 12 other people actually feel the same way. So yeah, that's how serious you have to take this. So it says 200,000. Probably it's more like 1 million people actually think that we shouldn't have the Olympics. Again, I am one of those people, and I didn't actually go to change.org and sign the petition. But if you asked me, I would say this does not seem like a good idea. Thomas Bach. It's B-A-C-H, so I assume it's probably Bach if you're in English. But, Bach. I don't know. I'm not going to waste time. It's not Dick Pound. There's one of the Olympic Committee guys is called Dick Pound, and I just want him to be the person just so I can say Dick Pound all the time. He is the IOC president, and he was going to come to Japan to prove everything was hunky-dory and everything was cool and we can have the Olympics and it's going to be safe. He was going to join the torch relay in Hiroshima. Because of the state of emergency, and it gets extended by tomorrow, at least until the end of the month, he can't go to Tokyo. And again, like I said in one of the previous bits, because it's 10 weeks out, that actually looks really bad because here he is trying to prove that the Olympics are going to go off without a hitch. And the first hitch is that the guy who runs the Olympics isn't actually able to come into the country where the Olympics are supposed to happen. Just weird little things I found out about Olympic athletes and what's going to happen to them if they actually have the Olympics, if they actually show up. There's there's a bunch of Olympic athletes or people who were potential Olympic athletes who are saying they're not going to come. And I actually could see that number being significant. I guess for a lot of people, the chance to go to the Olympics is probably once in a lifetime. There are people who go to like multiple Olympics and stuff, but I think a lot of people, there's only one chance. So they would probably go to take the risk. And these are fit people, so I guess if they get COVID, they're more likely to survive. That's still not the best way to do it. I also found out that like a huge percentage of Olympic swimmers have asthma. My son had asthma when he was young, and I got him into swimming because he had asthma, because I'd read this thing about the Olympics. And you hold your breath and you do a lot of breathing stuff, even like not necessarily consciously, and it's really good. And he doesn't take medicine or anything anymore for his asthma. So it's a bit of information for you. If you have asthma, try swimming. The athletes are going to get daily testing, PCR tests. They are not allowed to take public transit. They can take the Shinkansen if they book an entire car. I have no idea how much that cost. I've taken the Shinkansen when I went to our head office in Osaka. But it cost me like, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 yen, so $50 to $100, somewhere in there. I actually forget how much it is. I haven't gone in a long time. That's one seat. So reserving a whole car, that's crazy. So anyone from, I'm thinking only rich people, but I don't think of athletes as being particularly rich people. The American basketball team is usually pros, so they could probably do it, but you gotta be careful. I think most normal people, even athletes like your shot putter, he's not making so much money that he could actually book a whole Shinkansen car if he wanted to go. And hospitals will have priority beds for athletes. And this set off the internet again, because why are hospitals giving priorities to athletes when citizens are there and already sick? And they were talking specifically about Tokyo, because Tokyo right now is being overrun. They're saying they don't have enough beds. So why are certain hospitals and or beds being saved for Olympic athletes when there are citizens who pay taxes and they should get the beds? And that is a very tough situation because these athletes need to be taken care of. But at the same time, so do the people. And it's the people who do pay the taxes who pay for the hospitals in Japan because it's socialized healthcare. Honestly, sensible solution is if they actually had the healthcare workers, the doctors, the 10,000 people they wanted, as I said in the earlier story, if they got those people, they should set up like a mini hospital in the Olympic Village. Again, should maybe spoken to me first. Have a COVID prepared section, a building for sick COVID stricken athletes, which is that's happening again. That sort of takes us back to maybe you shouldn't be having the Olympics in the first place. Here's a story. It's vaguely related to COVID. Because it's talking about COVID funds. There's a town, you may have actually seen this. If you follow Japanese news, you probably saw this, but you probably saw it with a very specific headline. And the more I looked into it, it isn't 100% accurate. They said there's a town in Ishikawa. I think the town was called Noto. And all the articles, like for the first 2-3 days, said town gets COVID relief money, builds giant squid statue, which is sort of true, but it's not accurate. And so this is one of the things where I, reading multiple versions of the same story, start to get tiny facts that sort of don't make sense, and I can start to put it together. This was interesting to me because, yes, they did get COVID money, and yes, they did build a giant squid, but they didn't take the COVID money to build the giant squid. That's actually where the news stories are being slightly sensationalized. Building the squid cost 25 million yen. That's a lot of money. And every other story I read up to a certain point actually said, town spends COVID relief money to build giant squid, because it sounds like this town's being incredibly irresponsible. I think building a giant squid is already questionable, but they say it's going to bring in tourists. But of course, right now there are no tourists, so there's a lot of ifs flip-flopping back and forth there. What actually happened was they already had the money. They had the 25 million yen set aside to build the giant squid, but they were waiting because they didn't know if they were going to have to pay for the COVID relief themselves. So the local government would have to pay like restaurants or other things like that. They didn't know if they'd have to pay that themselves or if they were going to get money from the central government, the COVID relief funds. When the COVID relief funds came in, they released the squid money to build the statue. You can still say that that's relatively irresponsible in this moment. I think that's actually fair. Like, maybe now is not the time to be building giant squid. But the news stories that come out that they took the COVID money to build the giant squid are actually inaccurate. So that's something you have to be careful of when you read the news, because when you get a really essentially exciting title, it might be worth looking into whether or not that title is actually accurate as to what's actually happening in the story. So go out and search for Ishikawa, probably just giant squid statue. It'll come up right away. And I bet they all say, like, the town got the COVID money and built a giant squid. That's bad reporting. Ninja News Japan has suddenly is more thorough than a lot of news sources. Only because I read multiple and they all had slightly different takes on it. And I was like, there's something being interpreted here. So I think actually right now they should have kept the 25 million yen for the squid in, like, kept holding it until, again, after everything, the economy and stuff is back in order, and then build your giant squid, because you're going to have more money coming in the future. They might still, in the weeks to come, have something else go wrong. And that 25 million yen would have been more helpful in that situation. But I guess you could just say it's never really the right time to build a giant squid. Talking about money and COVID, this was an interesting way of phrasing this. So there was an article I read, and it was that they're talking about after COVID's taken care of, which, again, best case scenario might be another year or two because of how poorly they've handled the situation in Japan. They expect a rebound to be really sudden and really sort of powerful. They expect Japan to just bounce back really quickly. And this is because right now they're estimating there's been 20 million yen in forced savings. So because people aren't allowed to go on holidays, people aren't able to travel overseas, people aren't able to spend the money they normally would have spent, that money's still sitting in banks. So because that money's still sitting in banks, they've actually saved that money. So when the situation gets back to some sort of normal, they expect people to just take all that money they've saved and just suddenly start spending it. I think this is the Bank of Japan expects this rebound to be massive. I think that's particularly optimistic, because I wouldn't suddenly go, well, I didn't return to Canada this year, so I now have, let's say, $2,000 extra dollars. I'm going to immediately go spend that $2,000. I would most likely just live my life as I'd already been living it. Like, so yes, maybe I plan on going to Canada X amount of years in the future, but I wouldn't go like one more time. I guess that wouldn't help Japan. I get you pay for the plane ticket in Japan, but I'm not going to spend that money. I would just leave that money in the bank. So I think this is especially optimistic. I probably would go out to a couple restaurants. but I'm not going to go out $2,000 worth. And I'm going to go out drinking a few more times, maybe like celebrate the fact that we can go out again. People are still doing that anyways. I'm just not one of them. But this optimistic attitude is why they've actually ended the states of emergency early, and we've just begun our fourth one. Oh, we've got our third state of emergency. I keep always getting this mixed up. We're starting our third state of emergency because of our fourth wave of coronavirus. That's, to me, one of the problems is the economists certainly are looking at this in an incredibly optimistic way. And that is problematic because they're not being sensible. So yes, there may be 20 trillion yen in forced savings. That doesn't mean you're going to have 20 trillion yen in sudden spending once the state of emergency is lifted, especially because I personally, when they lift the next state of emergency, am still not going to act like the state of emergency has been lifted. I'm not going out until, again, we're free of coronavirus, which even then I might be suspicious because of how poorly all this has been handled up to this point. I'm going to end up being one of those people who, like, 6 months from now, then I might consider COVID gone. When I've never heard a story about it. You're going to hear stories about, like, again, once the vaccines have been all doled out, you're going to start hearing stories about, like, effects, so the long-term effects and things like that. I'm going to be one of the people who lives as if we're still in a state of emergency until those stories go away. And then I'm going to venture out very carefully to places that I think are actually doing things properly. We got two other stories that are not COVID or Olympic related, which is not many. The news was just absolutely dominated by coronavirus and absolutely dominated by the Olympics, because we're now getting to a point where it logically looks like the Olympics is not a sensible thing to have happen. In America, someone will be like, hey, this is Ninja News Japan, not Ninja News America. Don't worry, it comes around. In America, recently, Mortal Kombat came out. And at the same time, Kimetsu no Yaiba, so Demon Slayer, Mugen Train, Mugen? Actually, not sure. It's Infinity Train, also came out. And this is the first Japanese movie in the last 20 years to take the number one spot in, like, the weekend release numbers. So that's money. It made 6.42 million in ticket sales in the first weekend, beating out Mortal Kombat, which was probably the only other movie that came out. I saw Mortal Kombat, had a couple of good scenes, but actually, if you're going to talk about quality of movie, not great. Saw Kimetsu no Yaiba as well. It was better than Mortal Kombat. Still not going to say it was good. My complaint about Demon Slayer is that it is just, it's good in that if someone has never seen an anime before, this hits every single beat of every anime. Like, every sort of trope in an anime is in this thing. So if they like this, they will probably like other anime. If they don't like this, there's a lot of anime they might still like, because, I actually don't like the bog standard stuff. But it would be a good litmus test for whether someone is going to like anime, because if they like this, they're going to like most of the stuff out there. Demon Slayer was rated R in the United States, whereas in Japan, it's actually like kids are allowed to go to it. And this was a conversation I had with someone else, another parent, because my 9-year-old reads the comics and watches the cartoons. And if I had known that, I actually would have said no. But my wife, being Japanese, because she's of the mindset that this is a Japanese story and it's an anime for kids, the target audience is kids, that it's fine. There are some gruesome scenes. Like, there's a scene where the main character's sister, kicks a dude's head off. And in the comic, it's a bit unclear, but you can tell what's going on. In the anime, it's pretty clear that head comes straight off. They keep flashing back to the scenes where the main character goes back to his home and his whole family's been slaughtered and they're all laying in pools of blood. It's really gruesome. My coworker, being American, was a little bit more focused on the underlying bondage aspects. He's like, he didn't want to show that to his kids. It was interesting to me because that's the thing. In America, violence is okay and sex is something they're uptight about. In Japan, well, I guess sex and violence are both okay to a degree, but they're more cautious about violence in Japan than they are about sex. The other movie 20 years ago that actually took the number one movie spot on opening weekend was actually one of the Pokemon movies. So that's interesting, I guess, if you care about Pokemon, which I do not. I'm more interested in how this movie's. I would actually say, because of the violence, because there's not really any sexual into it. The main characters are quite young. So one main character wants to find a girlfriend, but it's all it's presented very innocently. The violence is pretty graphic though, because there's a lot of blood sprays and things getting cut off. Yeah. I would actually be interested in other people's opinions on Kimetsu no Yaiba and what you think the target audience should be, not what it is, what it should be. In Japan, I would say it's aimed at young teens. So it's probably aimed at my son who's like 14 years old. It's got not really any sex, but the characters can be quite sexy. There's a lot of like tying people up and bondage and stuff. And the girl has the thing in her mouth and that's being turned into a bondage thing, obviously pretty quickly. But it would be interesting what people think the actual appropriate age range for that is, because I'm not 100% sure. I find the violence is too graphic for young people. I don't think the sex is really there like other people do. I think that might be more of a reflection on the person than on the actual anime itself. I know he sometimes listens to this stuff, so it'll be interesting to see if he listens to that, brings it up at work. Japan is started working on safety standards for flying cars. I guess this is the most hopeful story of the whole day. Like realistically, they've created guidelines for test flights. They've created standards for performance and safety. And by 2023, they want to allow flying cars, I guess this wouldn't be cars, it would be more like vans, for transporting goods, transport to remote islands. So that would have people on it. And they want to have flying cars in urban areas by 2030. I think this is good if it's automated, if it's not done with a human pilot. We've already seen how badly people behave when they're given a Tesla with autopilot, which I knew autopilot did not mean you're supposed to like sit in the passenger seat and let the car drive. You're supposed to just sort of relax. But all the car crashes where the car's on autopilot, the driver's doing something stupid because you're not actually, I don't think you're supposed to take your hands off the wheel. I think you're supposed to sit there with your hands on the wheel and just make sure things don't go awry. And people are too dumb to realize that's actually the case. And that's why they're crashing their cars. I don't blame Tesla in basically any of those car crashes because I think they've made it fairly clear you're still the driver. Autopilot means it's guiding the car, not driving the car. People are dumb. And maybe they shouldn't have called it autopilot. That actually may have been their mistake. But people taking that seriously and actually letting the car drive, that's Darwin at work, Darwinism at work, because, yeah, I'm worried about flying cars and human pilots. I don't know if I would be happy with that. If you have the licensing may be so strict that only amazing people can get it. Like I wouldn't be able to get one. I would be 100% okay with that as a concept. I should not be allowed to drive a flying car. I've crashed is a bit strong, but I have damaged my own car on the ground without any other cars around. I hit a stationary object. So me in a flying car suddenly losing it, maybe, no, it's still a bad idea. No, I can't think of a concept. I was about to say, like, if you had a video game controller, I would still mess it up. I would crash into a building because I do that in video games, if that's anything to go by. So no, I should not be allowed to drive a flying car. I am betting you should not be allowed to drive a flying car too. Robots, automation, I actually would have a little more faith in that. But then you're going to have to get into like 6, 7G wireless technology so they can actually talk to each other and not crash into each other, and buildings. I think, again, the 2023, 2030 predictions for that, bit optimistic. If you want people in the pilot seat. Robots, 2030, I could actually see that happening.
You can tweet questions or comments at Ninja News Japan or join the Facebook group. On Facebook, search for Ninja News Japan. Sexy out homies.
It is the fastest change. I have to be really specific. It's the fastest petition to 2002. It's